Hey everybody, my name is Jim Farmer. I'm the festival director of Out on Film. This is our 34th year of presenting films for, by, and about our community and its allies. This, however, is a first year as a hybrid festival, meaning we have films in theater and we also have really terrific virtual programming as well. This film in particular, Keep the Cameras Rolling, The Pedro Zamora Way, is our closing night film. It is extraordinary. We are so happy to be able to premiere here in Atlanta. I think a lot of people are going to love it. This film is actually one of the films that is available in theater, and then following that will be a 1 week streaming run. And I think everybody's going to love this film. We are so happy. I'm going to introduce the co-directors of the film, Stacey Woelfel and Bill Horner. Thank you for being here. Chanel Haley, who is one of our great programming folks, is here to moderate. So I'm going to let you all get to it. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. I want to say that this is probably well, it's not the first film, but it was the first feature film that I saw when we doing the screening process that I actually loved. Like definitely, yes. I think that there was some nostalgia in it, some relation to it, because as a fan of watching The Real World, I remember this. But of course, I was a teenager then, so it's now seeing it as an adult. And then also, working in the field of HIV and advocacy like that, it hits differently now. Mm-hmm. And realizing about how impactful this was. So I think my first question is that I think that maybe our viewers may be having too, is because, in the title and in this the caption, keep the cameras rolling. And then you say in there, to do a sound bite from, this is the true story of, right? Like in Real World, right? So was it difficult to get this footage from MTV? How did that come about?
So the footage, actually, we're using it under fair use. So the footage is out there. People can see this. It's of all places on Daily Motion, if you want to find the show and watch it there. And so that footage we obtained via fair use from there. We got some things from Millie, Pedro's sister, and photographs and that sort of thing. But it's really just fair use as we comment on the show.
Okay. Well, that's good to know.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I think that another question that comes up when watching it, again, from there to now, and then actually even, listening and taking in the interviewing that was done from former cast members who were talking about Pedro and how connected, and then also hearing from, I think it was Murray that was interviewing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right. Is that, they specifically, when they were casting, had in their head about the AIDS pandemic that was happening during that time, particularly in San Francisco, and they wanted to cast somebody that was living with HIV or AIDS. It so happened that, Pedro was this, this gorgeous educator from Miami, but still, that was in mind. But then when you watch this film, I want to know if y'all think, or your opinion, what was put together, or what you want people to even perceive from watching it. Is this more about Pedro himself? No, not that. That's not the wrong question. Who should get the credit for making this monumental, educational, groundbreaking reality, in the sense of they put HIV and AIDS in the forefront and made it relatable and likable, in the sense of wanting to sit there and learn about this and moving forward? Is it, MTV, Murray for being insistent that this was talked about? Or is it Pedro because Pedro was just like, this hot guy who was very personable and we wanted to see?
So I would argue it's a little bit of both. When we talked to John Murray about this, it was clearly a goal for he and his producing partner, Mary Alice Bunham, mm-hmm. to have, and even, you know, felt a sense of obligation because they knew they were going to San Francisco with this third season. And so, and MTV was cooperative, right? I mean, I didn't get the, oh, I'm very sorry about that. I didn't get the sense, and if Stacey did, felt differently, that MTV really interfered much at all with the production of the show. So, and certainly were supportive of this message. But casting, you know, finding Pedro and casting Pedro was like a lightning from the sky in terms of just pure, pure gold. And he was on a mission, right? He was sicker than he probably, you know, well, Murray says he was sicker than he admitted to, and he wanted to get his message out. And so I think it's a combination of everybody, but I think Pedro deserves a lot of the credit for the message. But then, you know, Pam Ling talks about the fact that it could have gone any way in the editing room. And she gives a lot of credit to Murray and Bunham and the producers for the way they edited it in a way that was, you know, Pam would argues, you know, fair and honest and not sensational. And so I think a little, you know, the credit can be shared by them, but certainly it wouldn't have worked. I mean, it's hard to imagine anybody else but Pedro filling that role.
Right. I think I like to say people make their own luck. And I think the production team at Bunham Murray did that. They wanted to find somebody for the cast. They thought they would find somebody in San Francisco because that's where the show was set. But they put themselves out there. And then, as Bill says, they really did a great job editing the show and deciding that the story was not about Pedro dying. The story was not about a lot of other things. It was about everything that Pedro was as this complete person that really was a role model and a symbol on television.
Yeah. Are y'all aware that this is, well, the 27th was National Gay Men's HIV and AIDS Awareness Day. Mm-hmm. So I think there's some very good significance about this film being played, being shown, and particularly, again, it's just so fascinating for me living and watching then to now of how it's so much has changed. The perception has changed. And I think that, you know, look, we hear the interviews like with Bill Clinton, or even with Campos, the girl that was on the show.
Rachel Campos.
Right. Rachel was on the show. Even how, you know, perception changes over time. Because I remember back then, you know, my first and I learned in school, but a personal connection to me was that I had a classmate whose father died from complications of AIDS. And because of that, the AIDS quote came to my school. So I had a personal connection with somebody who their father died from this disease, complications of this disease. And so then seeing that on television, like, oh, okay, this is bigger than my school, you know? And then, you know, now again, fast forwarding to now where, you know, I work in an organization that actually does HIV advocacy around laws and policies, where back then people was protesting just to even get to be allowed to, like, you know, be seen as normal as people. Yeah. And, you know, considered to be 50% of a population of gay men were living with HIV. And now we are, you know, it's like, it's a protected class, it's a part of disability, you know, there is medications, you know, to prevent, we have PrEP now, it's so different. And I think that what is so interesting about Pedro themselves was how most people who go onto reality TV shows are going to become famous in whatever it is they do, right? Muhammad said that. He said that he was in a band, I'm gonna do this, exposure. Pedro has exposure already. Like, he had a scrapbook, okay? But he took, and I think he already been to Congress and testified, right? So this was about his heart was pure of wanting to educate people about HIV and AIDS. And I think that this film beautifully showed that, because, and also the genius of even casting him, that was beautiful in showing that, right? Because, where other people was trying to, build off of that career of being on real road, he took his career and kind of dummied it down. Like when he went to Rachel's families, and was skating around him being a gay man because he's in a school in conservative Texas, right? So he couldn't really get into that part. He had to only say certain things like that, and so it actually kind of lowered what he would normally say. And so I wanted to ask the question: is that, what do you think the perception is showing that today versus then? Because we know if this film that y'all made was done and showed back then, people would be like, oh my God. But today, do you think that people's like, oh, well, no big deals? I mean, duh. I mean, who doesn't have HIV these days? It's not a big deal.
The team that worked on this, Bill and I are professors. And so the team that worked on this was made up of students. And so they are 20, 21, 22 years old. And so they didn't know who Pedro was before we started working on this. And just like you say, it was so different back then. They didn't know. I mean, they have grown up in a time where marriage equality exists, where the treatment for AIDS exists, and those sorts of things. And so, we're here to teach. And so part of that was, it was a great exploration. They did the research, they did the interviews, they helped come up with the structure and do all those sorts of things. And so we got to watch through them putting the film together what we think it will do for audiences, particularly younger audiences. If you're under 40, you probably don't know who Pedro is. You'd probably, you might have watched The Real World, but it was a lot different. The show changed over the years, so it wasn't what it was in '94. And so
Absolutely.
our hope was that
There's a lot more drinking towards the end.
Our hope was that people
Hot
would be able to see how quickly, you might say quickly, depends on your point of view, things have changed, not everything. And also see those things that are the same. And there are things that echo through the film that are still the same today.
Yeah. Anyone to add, Bill?
Yeah, I mean, I think Stacey captured that pretty well, actually. It was when we got started, we gathered this group of students and sort of laid out the project. And the first question we asked was, so how many of you have heard of Pedro? And not one kid raised their hands, right? but they all went and they watched them, and they binge things, right? And so they watched every single episode in about a day, and they were fully on board, and they understood the power of the story, and then we set them to work on research, and they did all kinds of research, right? We had a team doing research on, public opinion. We had a team doing research on history of HIV and AIDS, and we had a team doing work on reality TV and the impact that reality TV can have, and so I think that it will be interesting to finally have our world premiere. We've shown it to a couple of groups of students, but that's it. That's our audience that's seen it are all kind of 18 to 22 years old. And they all have the same reaction, which is the power of Pedro's story, and I think some sense of amazement about how things used to be, right? Maybe they've talked about this with their parents, maybe not, but it's very eye-opening for them, and I think that's part of the power of Pedro's story, is that for them to see somebody who was their age, right? I mean, he was 22. And who put everything on the line to make change in the world. And so I think that message certainly gets through, regardless of the era.
So you brought up about youth today are living under the passage of marriage equality. So that takes me then to even watching this film, or when there was even before the film became about, when he was just doing the research and seeing when kids want to put it together, or when they were doing the interviews, did it stick out in their head? And do you think it pops off the screen about the fact of Pedro and Sean even getting married at a time when it wasn't a real thing? It was a ceremony. It was, it was symbolizing.
It's interesting, and some of the cast members speak to this, right? That I think it was Rachel, right? Rachel says, she thinks, Pedro knew how important it was, and John Murray knew how important it was, and maybe Pam and Judd knew how important it was. But other than that, not so much, that it was not earth shattering. But that's one of the things that's so interesting, compelling about this story, right? I mean, there are not a lot of issues that you see public opinion change so rapidly as it has on marriage, on the question of marriage equality.
Right.
And I think that Pedro and Pedro's story and Pedro and Sean and doing this on national television, I mean, I think they deserve a fair share of the credit for that change.
Yeah. Do you think that, I mean, over time,
not to take away, by the way, not to take away from
Yeah.
all of the other advocacy that has gone on and all of those things, but I think at the time it was a starting the conversation moment that kind of jump started the conversation.
No, but what you're saying is that what I was going into is that because so much work has been done since then.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you, when this film popped up and I watched it, I was like, I work in HIV advocacy, and why hasn't this come up? Like, why isn't Pedro referenced ever?
Yeah.
And
we talked about that.
Yeah,
we talked
yeah,
about that. Yeah, we talked about that. Putting the film together is like, we're sort of surprised. There have been a couple of sort of motion picture attempts at this before, a fictionalized, movie of the week sort of thing, but there hasn't been a lot to tell his story. So we thought it was a prime story to tell.
So with that being said, then what do you think Pedro's ultimate legacy is?
I think it's, for me, it's really in the public opinion range, that there was a whole generation of people, who knows how old they are now. This was 27 years ago. So, they're between early 40s and late 50s, probably something like that, who got to see Pedro. And I think Judd talks about this particularly well in the film, but got to see Pedro as this guy that they would have liked to have known, that they would have liked to have had as a friend, and that they got to see everything that he went through. And it just put a seed in their mind that, there are a lot of people like this, this, what they're going through is what's normal for a lot of people, and I think that's it. So in terms of public opinion, that's, to me, it's legacy.
Yeah, and I think it's public opinion. It's a sense for that whole, So I'm 53. I was 24, I guess. Am I doing the math right there? I think 23, 24. And I had watched the first two seasons. I was a Real World fan, and so it had a profound impact on me. I think it had an impact on all kinds of audiences. I think it had an impact on people who were LGBTQ, that saw in Pedro somebody who was living out and putting that message and getting that message out. I think it had an impact on people who are not LGBTQ, who saw in Pedro, wow, he's a great guy. And maybe if I've been prejudiced in my way I've been behaving, maybe it had a positive impact there. So I do think the impact on public opinion is a major part of his legacy. I hope that in a new sort of generation of people seeing Pedro, or an older generation being reminded of Pedro, that the other legacy is that, one person really can be an agent of change, and that I hope that it inspires others to want to be an agent of change like Pedro was.
Absolutely. I want to say that I want to point out that I think there was more to be highlighted, or that we should take from this also, because it wasn't just about, that we saw the life of, or a snippet of a life of a person who lived with HIV, but it was also, we saw somebody in an interracial relationship.
Yeah.
We also saw somebody, an openly gay man, become friends with a heterosexual man.
Yeah.
And these are things that, particularly during that time, was just like heard of. Like, some straight man is not going to be like, I'm friends with, best friends with a gay guy. And even now, when you hear Judd talking, his passion for not just the cause, but also you hear his love for his friend Pedro and missing him, which helped bring him and Pam together, So it was, that stood out to me also, because as we are now in doing the advocacy, and I know like we do our strategy, whatever, and trying to touch, we talk about changing hearts and minds. It's tearful. It's about connecting to somebody that's either like you, or that you can recognize that there's somebody in your family or your circle or nucleus that actually is part of that community. And it touched on so many different. And I think that was a mistake. I don't think they planned it that way, right? That's something that became organic, that happened, right? And then even talk about the fact that Pedro was originally from Cuba,
Right.
So that's a whole other thing too by itself. In the early 90s, coming off of the Asian the 80s, the conflict, so it was so many different variables to me, I think, that made this work. And that's why I asked the question earlier about, was this by design from MTV, or was it Pedro? And I think that really Pedro, by luck of the draw, was the golden ticket, right? And I will tell you when I was looking this up, I looked this up on Wikipedia. This season is credited with bringing popularity to the real world.
Right. Yeah. Yep. Absolutely.
And, what we talked about it, as we said before, is that as time is going on, the real world did change. Okay, it became a lot more drunken parties and sex than it did educational messages. Right. Still entertaining, I watched the real world and the challenges, all fun. But I think that this one is really the one that stands out when it comes to, and I think also in history, that even if people do not know Pedro's name nor the season, what they do know is, when you say it, that's the one that died from HIV on Real World, right?
Right.
And I hope that in the future, that is definitely not part of his legacy. That was more about the work he did while he was here, because he got a lot done while he was here.
Yeah.
And that's something that I admire, because again, it's somebody that works with an organization that does this, especially around policy, is that Pedro did very well. I'm also very impressed as a person who's very blunt, that when, he spoke about, as an educator, he said it in terminology that the everyday man can understand. Yeah. And everyday person can understand. Mm-hmm. And so that's important to recognize also. And I think that's kind of what helped move the needle. I've taken public speaking classes before, and when you're speaking, particularly in camera, on the news or TV shows, it's about connecting to what we call Marge, the one in the middle, right? The one that's on the fence. And so, he did that very well, of being able to sit there and say, hey, this is me being likable, as we all said before, but then also getting the message across without it sounding rehearsed. He wasn't, it was very, very, it was very familial. And which was important because, like you said, the age group, your students that was part of this or that you showed to, that would have been age group back then that watched it. And so to see and know that Pedro stands the up against time is absolutely amazing. Yeah. Where is it that people can actually watch this now?
So we're out on the festival circuit right now, world premiere, happening right there with your festival. It has a number of others where it will play around the country. And, we're in talks with somebody for distribution. So we're hoping we can get it out on streaming services, but just don't know yet. Still working on that.
I think that you have an excellent shot at getting on streaming services. This is big time. I see the biggest networks paying you top dollar for this because it was done very well. Number one, we were all surprised that this was a university that did this, because it was like, this is A1 work. Of course, in the way, whether the shooting, the editing, the interviews you had in there, excellent. So This is my first time saying this in these interviews, but I totally give it 5 stars because I think that it really is something that I would want to show, and I would just watch at home. This is my own. Like I would totally turn this on to any Netflix or HBO, and just watch this because it's interesting to me. So,
Well, thank you. That's very kind.
Job to you, all producers, all your staff and volunteers. This is wonderful.
Thank you very much for having people can see it here.
Yeah, we appreciate that very much, and I hope that we can make clear, well, we're going to right now, how proud we are of the students that worked on this. It was their dedication to this project is why it turned out the way it is. And if we had had students that were just in it, for the credit,
right,
for the credits, or to throw something on their resume, it wouldn't have been what it is. They really bought into it, and they really they worked their tails off, and with COVID coming along in the middle of it, and they stuck with it, and we meet some of those students at the festival, and so
excellent. Which also tells about, again, how great Pedro is, right? Because if the story was boring or Pedro was not interesting, then it would be just another story about HIV or AIDS. And we've seen those before, right? I mean, I grew up in the 80s and the 90s, and we've seen those after school specials. Those are good, but can they carry, an hour and a half? And do I want to work on this? Yeah. So that's amazing. Thank you so much for this interview. Is there anything that you want to leave with the audience, either before they watch the film, going to the film, or that you want them to take away from watching the film?
We've talked about a lot of it. I think you've hit on the points that we want to take away from it. I think it's something we should all, if there's a big picture thing, we should all look a little further in the past than we're used to, that we're always focused on today and moving ahead. But there are a lot of really important, really significant people out there that, while Pedro's not lost to history, maybe he should seek out a few more of those folks when we can.
Absolutely. To add to that, give people their roses when they're here.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you. I hope you all have an excellent weekend. And I have no doubt in my mind that this film will be very huge worldwide. And if you ever need anybody to send emails to promote, I am the person, because I really support this. And thank you so much for being here.
Well, Chanel, thank you so much. We really appreciate you taking the time and your interest and all the nice things you had to say. Uh-oh. That's happening.
All right. Bye-bye.